Welcome to the Style Free Podcast, where a father and son detail and digress on a wide variety of topics within music, art, family, and culture. Your hosts are Professor Stephen J. Tyson Sr. and Jr., also known as Dad and Papo. In today's episode, we discuss Doctor Strange, the art of Steve Ditko, and the mystical and spiritual connections to the work of other visual artists, including Georgiana Houghton, Hilma Af Klint, Mondrian, Kandinsky, Dali, and more. Welcome back, Dad.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Papo, as always.
Yeah, most definitely. Something that's been on my mind a bit lately. I've been watching a lot of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and catching up with some of the newer shows like WandaVision and The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. One of the things that I've been doing is also trying to catch up with a lot of the movies, starting from, let's go cinematic order, starting with Iron Man, but I've also tried to do it in chronological order as well, starting with Captain America, the First Avenger. And in that, made our way through the entire series. But one of the movies that stood out to me the most was Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange is going to be a very important character. There's going to be the Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, the sequel to this movie that comes out. And so that's supposed to open the door to the multiverse, where we end up getting some new characters, possibly the X-Men, or definitely going to be in this phase, getting introduced to the Fantastic Four and all. But it was really cool how Doctor Strange has become a very central figure for what the world will essentially experience as like the primary driver of the Marvel Comics universe, beyond just the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And Doctor Strange has always been a character that stood out to me a lot because as a kid growing up, I'd be perusing through your books on your library and seeing all the cool things that are interesting, and a lot of it, were a lot of different comic books and some other really cool art books and everything like that. But you had a Black Panther collection, but you had more specifically two Doctor Strange books that I thought were so cool. It was one was a collection; it was a smaller book. And I think a lot of the illustrations were more so in black and white. But then you had a larger one where a lot of the illustrations were in color. And as a kid, I was really captured by the artistry and the sci-fi kind of nature around the character and how the illustrations were drawn. And it kind of took you into these other dimensions and other worlds where Doctor Strange really tapped into a more cosmic and more spiritual connection than a lot of the other comic characters. So I'm watching all these, cinematic movies and from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and this movie, really stood out to me. And knowing how you had these books on your shelf, and even trying to recall some of the conversations that we had when I was a kid, Doctor Strange also seemed to be a character that really stood out to you a lot too. And I know the comic came out in the 60s and everything. So I was just curious about, your perspective on Doctor Strange and the influence that comic might have had on you just as a kid, as a young Black kid growing up in the 60s, but then also as, a kid who's very interested in art and very interested in expressing themselves through art, and how that, has kind of grown and manifested itself, as an adult.
Yeah, that's great. And I also want to follow up with you to find out what it is and how this particular character, for example, speaks to you in this day and age.
Yeah.
What the significance of a Doctor Strange is, in this generation, and from your experience. I can tell you that Doctor Strange was one of my first superhero characters. I like looking at the Sunday comic strips that would be in the newspapers. There were a lot of different characters that I liked. But when it came to comic books, one of the first comic books that spoke to me was not a superhero as such, but it was a comic book that was used as part of a community action agency called HARU, which did a study on the situation of poverty and powerlessness in Harlem. and really was a blueprint for community action agencies around the country. And the project director, and at another point, the executive director, was your grandfather.
That's Cyril deGrasse Tyson.
That's Cyril deGrasse Tyson, yes. And he had the vision, the foresight, to take this hefty document of analysis and to translate its findings into a comic book form that featured many of the people who were part of the study at this time. And so looking at the characters and the way that the artist would draw some of the scenes, this artist was using some surrealistic approaches. When I say surrealism, I'm talking about a way going beyond reality, dealing with tackling subject matter that, instead of showing it just straight the way that you would, in a very literal way, would use it almost metaphorically to represent the conditions and situations that were affecting the community. Only in a few instances, but those, and particularly on the front cover of that comic book, that stood out to me. And I'm like 7.5 years old or so, at the time.
And Haryu, that was for
Harlem Youth Unlimited.
And that was the same program that young Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was part of too, right?
Well, that's correct. That's absolutely correct. A young aspiring journalist by the name of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
He didn't have that name though back then.
No, at that time he was known as Lou Alcindor Jr. And he came from the Dyckman Street projects, around 200th Street in Manhattan. So it was a lot of young people came through that program. But to go back to the comic book, like I say, that really had a strong impact on me. Again, I'm like 7.5 or so when this document came out. And so to see these images and the stories, and it even featured a young Joan Gans Cooney as a director of a film. And of course, she would later go on to start Sesame Street. So Joan Gans Cooney was your grandfather who told her that it was important to document and include the people, their actual voices, as part of the documentary that she was putting together called Haryu's Harlem. And as a result, she got an award from that particular production. And that kind of contributed to her clout, if you would say, in the industry, which helped to lay the groundwork for the Sesame Street program later on.
That's incredible.
So, yeah. So at any rate,
so if you're, around 7 years old, reading this comic book from Haryu,
I'm almost 8.
Yeah, so that's around the time that Doctor Strange came out too, because Doctor Strange premiered in 1963.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Out of Strange Tales. In fact, he was kind of in the back of the comic. he wasn't a headliner.
Yeah.
At the time, and because nobody had ever heard of a character like this. And what stood out to me about that was just, first of all, the artwork of Steve Ditko. There was just something about it that was very straightforward. Some might say in some cases it was a little stiff. I kind of felt that way sometimes. It was a certain formality, to his approach, as opposed to somebody like Jack Kirby, which was all about muscle and shadow and highlight, the sculpture, this heft.
Steve Ditko's characters were definitely a little more slender, thinking about Peter Parker and the first iteration of Spider-Man and things like that. Yeah,
that's right. And if you think about the countenance of some of the characters, whether it's Peter Parker or his grandmother or his aunt, it's a kind of plainness, a very straightforward, clean-cut, direct style about that. Yeah. Now, I'm not talking about the action scenes, but even in the action scenes, even those actions were measured in some ways.
Yeah.
And whereas Jack Kirby's was more, a lot of diagonals and thrust. And if we would compare the styles in some way in terms of art history, we could say that there was more of a influence of Caravaggio and Rubens, in terms of those diagonals in the work of Jack Kirby, And in the work of Steve Ditko, it might be more of a Nicolas Poussin, French Baroque artist, whose characters tended to be, in fact, he used to use, the way I understand it, he used to use little wax model figures, as
Ditko did or Poussin?
Poussin, talk about emotional content in many cases.
Not anger.
Their characters are more studied, more, stayed in their appearance. Even when they're, like two characters are tumbling in space, it's pretty much that. Now, where there's a break, where there's a difference with Doctor Strange, is when Steve Ditko is opening up the door to these other realms, to these other dimensions. That you had never really seen anything like that in comic books before, at least not to that extent.
Yeah.
Now there are antecedents, in terms of these sorcerers or magicians and, people who were in touch with, the supernatural. So it wasn't that it was the first. There was a particular character by the name of Shandu the Magician, who was a very popular character who was connected with, again, the supernatural. There were people like Yarko the Great, master of magic. That's another character. Mandrake the Magician. A lot of these characters coming out in the 1930s. Some of them have been radio shows, some of them were films, and I think that a lot of these were probably part of the influence for people like, Stan Lee. And so I thought that's one of the things that's important to, to mention, that there's a context for all of these things.
Yeah. So Stan Lee came up with the character and Steve Ditko kind of made it come to life and drew it.
Correct. Yeah. One of the things that I would say about Doctor Strange is that his story, really piques the imagination. There's a certain intersection between science, because remember, he was a neurosurgeon. And
yeah, that's right.
He had an accident and it affected his ability to be a surgeon. And he was frustrated and he was sick. And he also was very vain and egotistical and had an attitude and all that sort of thing. And so this made him confront himself, and so I think that there's something very existential about that and about the character in that sense. And part of this idea of, facing self and pulling oneself up, but he didn't do it alone. He traveled, he went to Tibet and he encountered the Ancient One, which was a sage that put him in a situation where he had to come to terms with who he was. I think you could see some aspects of this in The Matrix later on. Right? And there are many other kinds of movie vehicles that have arisen, which I think the roots of which can be traced back to, again, Doctor Strange, Shandu the Magician, and this idea of not only going to different dimensions, but also the idea of shape-shifting, becoming something else or becoming more of who you are.
Yeah.
There's something aspirational about that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that appeals to people. I think people also love a good story. People sitting around, in caves or wherever. I mean, this is just part of the DNA of who we are as individuals, to make sense of the world, but also when faced with situations where there are limitations or where there are threats or there's oppression or whatever, what do you go to help you get through, to navigate through those challenges, the challenges of life? Go ahead.
And they'll say a lot of the time it's people finding a story to connect to or to share, whether, now we have, Netflix or books or things like that, other stories that, we connect through stories and narratives in those types of ways. But back in the day, as you were saying, it'd be verbally or, with pictures on a wall or, however you're still communicating a story, and stories are also what create history, like and narrative. And yeah, I get what you're saying.
No, that's so true. That's so true. I mean, what's one of the important ways that we understand, our history it's through painting pictures with words
Mm-hmm.
or music,
Mm-hmm.
or the arts, things that are passed down from one generation to the next, whether it's through, again, oral history or through, books themselves. And so I think that again, the power, I think, behind characters like Doctor Strange is that it does open up new pathways, of awareness, or really an affirmation that subconsciously all of us realize that there's more to this life, or life itself than just what we see. It's like you look around and say, well, is this it? Or is this just a shadow or a reflection or a layer of a much richer and more vast reality?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that definitely connects to the whole concept around, multidimensional life or a multiverse and things like that, where, there are multiple layers to not just beyond, our visible scope and, the things that we can see in our limited range of visible light, but then just as far as what life is and how that connects with spirit and the other things that we really are still questioning and have so many questions about whenever it comes to life.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that you mentioned too was the Ancient One and how that character was very influential in teaching Doctor Strange, but that character was also, at least in the comic books, very specifically written to be, an Asian character. Mm. And then, here I am watching the film and expecting the character to also be, Asian, whether or not it's male or female, but, to at least have the cultural connection to a lot of the things that are expressed within the Doctor Strange, narrative, a lot of like the spiritual aspects of it and things of that nature, a lot of the magic and the mysticism around it, it does have, a lot of connection with various, ancient to current modern day Asian cultural aspects. Mm-hmm. And to see then in the movie that it's played by Tilda Swinton, I was like, is this whitewashing the character? Well, it is whitewashing the character. Well, it's not a question of if it is or isn't, but I was more like, how are they going to balance that or navigate that? Because as an actor, Tilda Swinton did an excellent job as the Ancient One. Mm-hmm. I'm watching the movie knowing that it's her, but then also being like, wow, like, yeah, this is also the Ancient One, I guess. Great job, Tilda Swinton. Like, excellent work. So, I don't want to take anything away from her as an actress, but at the same time, it's still head scratching that was a selection for somebody to be the Ancient One. I know that they wrote into the script around it being like, I can take many forms or have taken many forms, that kind of narrative, which then creates the invisible underlying conversation of the irrelevancy of race, but it doesn't touch on the importance of culture. And how the eraser of race also then erases culture that the entire Doctor Strange narrative draws from. So I think that a missing piece in the cinematic universe versus the comic universe was having an Ancient One that actually has a more visible representation to some of the more deeper and real cultural things that the comic has been based on.
That's a very interesting point that you bring up, and I think it's a valid discussion for sure. I mean, you could touch on images. This also connects to images, religious or spiritual images of, say, Jesus Christ. What did Jesus look like?
Yeah.
In some churches, he'll look this way. In other churches, he'll look that way.
Yep.
What is the significance of all of that? Some say, well, it really doesn't matter because it's all about the teachings. And then you talk about, well, let's see, let's take a look at the teachings. Let's take a look at, how things were put together or what was put in or what was, left out, how it's framed, the cultural context in which these stories are told. And so there's a lot to that. And that's perhaps something we could, begin to unpack at a later point.
Yeah.
But at any rate, going back to this idea of magic and the supernatural, well, like I said, it goes back a long way. And certainly in the West, there was a period of time in the 19th century where there was this religious movement called spiritualism. And basically it was, about communicating with the dead, and the idea that those who are dead, still have the ability to connect with those in the present, and that the dead could also provide answers. Now, some people feel that this connected with the idea of a reaction against the growing materialism that was taking place in the West in the 19th century. There are different opinions about that, but it did have a certain significant impact in terms of, how people thought about transcending, the limitations of their current situation. Some of those spiritualists were supporters of abolition against slavery. Some of them were suffragists, women suffragists. So if you see this, it's very interesting, this intersection of different interests and breaking out of the bonds or the chains that people felt that were preventing them from living there or actualizing their full potential as individuals, whether men, women, or people of color. Later on, of course, you have people like Helena Blavatsky, who was one of the developers of theosophy, the theosophical movement. And out of that, you have people like Rudolf Steiner and others who are also connected to the arts as well. The arts as a vehicle through which ideas and spiritualism and so forth could be communicated. Yeah. Artists like Wassily Kandinsky, one of the pioneering abstract artists, was one of those followers of, theosophy and Steiner. And then even in the earlier, like 40 years before him, there was a woman by the name of Georgiana Houghton. And she was a British artist and a spiritualist. And she would, conduct seances and so forth. And in her work, and I'm talking about in the 1860s and that period of time, she was creating abstract drawings, paintings and drawings and things on paper that were like what we would call, completely non-objective or abstract. And this is way before, the other, but she didn't see these as works of art per se, more so as information that was being channeled through her onto paper.
What was her name again?
Georgiana Houghton.
Wow.
Houghton.
Wow.
Others would follow in her wake, people like Hilma Af Klint. So you have people like, Kandinsky and Mondrian, one of my favorite artists, Mondrian. In fact, Piet Mondrian did a composition that he called Broadway Boogie Woogie. And like Kandinsky, he was inspired by music. And so Broadway Boogie Woogie is a reflection not only when he relocated to New York from Europe, and he set up a studio in Manhattan, and he used to go out dancing. He loved boogie woogie music. Yeah, Mead Lux Lewis and other composers, musicians like that. And so he reflected that painting, Broadway Boogie Woogie, is like a topographic view of New York with rectangles, primary colors, and you get the sensation of the movement, not only of traffic and buildings, but you also get a sense of the rhythms of music, right? And music has been connected to these artists that I talked about who were inspired by the ideas of spiritualism. In fact, Kandinsky wrote a book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. And my point is that music being a medium that you can't see, but you can feel, that it has the ability to touch the emotions. Mm-hmm. And that it also, as we've talked about in other episodes, has the ability to bring people together and to transcend barriers and boundaries. Yeah. So in many ways, this connects with the idea of spirit for many of these artists. And so therefore now I'm sort of circling back into this discussion of the work of Steve Ditko and Dr. Strange, because I've always loved music and I've always felt, the power of music. And I would say that a number of my works, I usually have music going while I'm working. But I think I also recognize in the work of people like Steve Ditko in Dr. Strange, that when the character would enter into these other realms, either going through a door and entering another realm, another universe that had pathways that intersected, that went over the other, that it was like a complex spatial network of different realities.
Yeah, whenever he would go to the astral plane.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Or being faced with eternity as an entity itself.
Yeah, or like he would go against Dormammu and all those other characters. Yeah.
Right. And so when you start thinking about these different characters as energies, as archetypes, in essence, that the individual has to face, that they're not just external, but they're also internal.
Yeah.
Right? And what's the thing that the Rocky said to Creed when he brought him into the gym and he faced the mirror and then he pointed and he said, talked about the toughest opponent you'll ever face is right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that many of these kinds of stories, you could see them, some people take them literally, but you can also think about them metaphorically, that they represent states of human consciousness, human feeling, physicality, all the things that we have to engage in, our own mortality, and how do we make sense of it? Some people say, well, this is it. That's the end. Other people say, no, there's another life. There's an afterlife. And so these stories are, I think, vehicles that allows us to engage in those bigger questions, those existential questions. And so that's, I think, subconsciously as a kid, being an artist, being, sensitive, even though I'm young, again, this is following, the assassination of John Kennedy. You begin really to see that, wow, these things can happen, or these situations that, the idea of permanence and stability. Well, what is there that you can rely on? What kind of ground is there, that you can take a position on, and to help you navigate, through life.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it was the colors, it was the storytelling, it was, growing up in the Catholic Church. There were plenty of stories and supernatural or spiritual characters and beings, and they all had different roles and so forth. So it was not so much of a stretch or a leap to begin to think of these characters, or to look at these characters in Doctor Strange and other sources, as plays. We used to, your grandparents would take us to plays. We would see dramas and things acted out.
Yeah.
On a stage, and as Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage, right?
Right.
Okay, and we're just, these characters, and we come on and we go off,
Yeah, we're merely players.
Exactly. And there are some people who, look behind the curtain, or inclined to look behind the veil, and see that there's some, and that's one of the things that is connected to surrealism. When you think about people like Salvador Dali, the persistence of memory, the floppy dripping clocks and
yeah.
Like, wow, what kind of reality is this? That's something that Alfred Hitchcock wanted to use, that concept in the dream sequence in a film called Spellbound with Gregory Peck and Ingrid Bergman.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he hired Salvador Dali to do the dream sequence.
That's incredible.
Yeah, because Ingrid Bergman in Spellbound played a psychiatrist, and she's dealing with a patient. The character is played by Gregory Peck. And so she engages him in going back to unsolve some of the mysteries of, related to his youth. And in that, he sees himself running, right?
Yeah.
And so this was created by Salvador Dali. And the idea, again, is to go back and look at a different way of understanding our reality, that just as Madame Curie in development of radium, laid the foundation for X-ray technology, that allowed people to see that you could see beyond the surface. Just as Einstein was beginning to question, the ideas of time and relativity and what is solid and what is not solid, and the relativity of things, and also think about the fact that technology speeding up in the early part of the 19th century, and so all this technological development, you have people like Nikola Tesla was beginning to forge ahead with his innovations, of which we are still influenced by, in our culture materially. And by the way, just to talk about Nikola Tesla for a second, he was good friends with a gentleman by the name of Swami Vivekananda. This was one of the forerunners of the Eastern spiritual traditions that would later flower themselves in the 1960s.
Wow.
We hear about Paramahansa Yogananda. He was somebody who was connected to, as well, Karla Pandit.
Right.
An African-American who posed as a Hindu organist.
We talked about him in the other episode.
That's correct. And so this idea of shape-shifting, the idea of taking on a different reality, of moving into new spaces, of transcending oppression or any restrictions that prevent you from actualizing the deeper qualities and attributes that you have as an individual.
Yeah, and you mentioned Karla Pandit too.
One of the things we were talking about with Karla Pandit was that he also, before he had his television show, he did not come out as African American, but he was the first African American to have his own television show in 1950. And prior to that, he was on a radio program, the second edition of Shandu the Magician. He did the organ music in the background for that. Now, imagine this. Karla Pandit, although he was known as Juan Rolando at that time, I think it was between 1948 and 1950 that he was doing the organ music for Shandu the Magician. Certainly, the characteristics that a Shandu the magician had can be linked in many ways to Stan Lee as Dr. Strange.
Yeah.
So when you think about characters like Dr. Strange, how do you find that relevant to life and culture today?
It's interesting because I feel my perspective of it is a bit different than probably just the general public's, because I think that the general public's understanding of a character like Doctor Strange comes solely from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I have a greater depth of understanding around like the nuances of like the spiritual layers or even just, when it comes to just the artistry and stuff like that, growing up, learning from you as a kid and hearing you, because you introduced me to Doctor Strange. So, I also, that was my foundation in kind of learning and understanding the character. So when I saw the character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it was really different because I think that they did a great job in conveying the artistry of Steve Ditko to the screen and kind of taking you into a different world. And it was very, it reminded me of Christopher Nolan's Inception to some extent in kind of how the movie looked. And I thought that was a great way of bringing that aspect of the comic into life. But whenever it came to certain aspects of the writing, I felt that there was more to be desired from my perspective because, and maybe that's going to come out in some of the sequels or whenever we see the character in other Marvel films. But I feel like there could have been more connection to some of the real spiritual connections that exist that it drew from. I think more so whenever it comes to today, though, the character of Baron Mordo is somewhat more reflective of the kind of reality that we're in right now, where you have somebody who wants to adhere to the code and the tenets of these ancient scriptures. And then they realize that the ancient one and the person who taught them that is actually not as pure in their intentions. And they're actually drawing from dark magic in order to prolong their longevity of life. And it's like, well, if you're doing that for that selfish reason, then all of this is for naught. And so that creates that creates the turn in his character going from a good guy in the movie to, by the end of the movie, more of he's not a bad guy, he's not a villain, but he's definitely setting himself up for, in the sequel, he'll be somebody who Doctor Strange is going to be going against.
Right.
So so I think that narrative is something that's more applicable to right now, whenever you have an ambition or an idealistic nature about something, and then you realize the greater reality of what it is, and then you're now struggling with that conflict inside. I think that narrative is very applicable to right now, because whether that's as, heavy-handed as, connecting it to what's going on right now with the public perception of the police, you have this idealistic narrative that's been whitewashed and conveyed to the American public for generations about who the police are, and there are heroes and there are these folks. And then we see the reality of policing in America. And it's like, that is not this idealistic thing that you've been telling us. And so what do I now do with knowing the reality versus what you told me? And so for me, I'm like, yeah, I ride with Baron Mordo in that, because here he is trying to adhere to what's right. And he has a line in the movie where he tells Doctor Strange, the bill comes due always. Which is basically another way of saying that the ends justify the means.
So we're kind of going back to this idea about, how do you deal with certain forces that impact your situation? How do you summon up, the courage and the fortitude to confront those, but also transform that moment into a positive out of a negative. Right? So, and what I was saying before is that in one hand, that's an external situation. The way that you could look at wars and conflict taking place, that's an external, but it begins inside.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And each of us are, have within us this struggle. It's like the grandfather who went to his Native American son, and the boy said to the grandfather, I'm paraphrasing, "Grandfather, I feel this struggle. There's two wolves inside of me. One is good and one is evil. And which one will win?" And the grandfather looked at the grandson and said, "The one you feed."
Right.
So when you talk about this, whether it's Shandu the Magician, you talk about the Yarko, another character, or Mr. Mystic, which came out of the Yarko character by Will Eisner. And you talk about Shandu the Magician, and then, to Doctor Strange. Again, these are all stories, good versus evil and that so forth. But there's also layers, particularly in Doctor Strange, of complexity. Like you said, the individual who starts out pompous and very selfish, and then faced with a crisis, is faced with the opportunity to transform his life in the service of good.
Yeah.
But that doesn't come easily, because he has to first unlearn, and he has to face those things first, that have held him from this greater realization of self. So knowledge of self, right? Know thyself, right? It goes back to well, it's universal, but we often look at the Oracle at Delphi and over the transium, know thyself.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's constantly with us. It's always with us. And each moment, essentially is that engagement. Like say, when the bill is due. What was the phrase that you used?
Oh yeah, he says the bill comes due always.
The bill comes due always, right? You could think of it in those terms. You could think of it in terms of karma. That every action, everything you put out there, it comes back. Now, learning how to leverage those moments to be able to see the bigger picture, so that one thing falls into another, that you don't get stuck in one particular modality per se. I think, again, goes back to that metaphor of the story of Doctor Strange and what Steve Ditko so skillfully laid out by showing these different rooms and dimensions and possibilities. We see that, of course, when we think about, I was talking before about oppressive situations. Why is it that we have Sun Ra was so important at the time, and what he was able to forge? The idea of another world, which George Clinton would take Parliament Funkadelic to another level, that Earth, Wind, and Fire would take to another level. Mm-hmm. Afrofuturism, Wakanda, right? In Black Panther, circling back to Marvel, the Marvel Universe.
Yeah, that's really incredible. I think that overall, there's going to be a lot that continues to get touched on in these Doctor Strange movies that come out, and the continuation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I hope that Kevin Feige continues to lay in some things that are relevant and happening right now socially within some of these characters and how these characters are developed, like we saw with Falcon and Winter Soldier. And I think that it's really exciting, and I'm definitely looking forward to having continued conversations with you, especially as Multiverse of Madness comes out and we're able to see how some of these things continue to unfold for this character. So
one thing that I didn't mention, one of the things that also intrigued me is the idea of, when you talk about the multiverse, that different realities can be existing simultaneously, that parallel realities can be existing.
Yeah.
That every moment that ends, is continued somewhere else, and we follow another trajectory of possibility, one of countless possibilities. Okay?
Yeah.
Einstein, right? Anyway, yeah. What are those entities called that disappear in one moment and then wind up on another part of
quarks?
Kind of like that. I think that also, that idea influenced some of the images that I create, where they disappear and then reemerge. Mm-hmm. And I get a resonance of that when I listen to like symphonic music, when I hear different passages and layers, things that disappear or little hints of something, and then they emerge as a motif, later on, and they flower and bloom into something, on a grander scale. All right, we better stop there because I could keep going.